Welcome back to lecture organization, this time part 2. So in this little mini lecture session, we are going to talk about the organizational plans of exemplifying a topic, describing a process or a sequence of events, and classifying. So let's just go ahead and start at the beginning, exemplifying the topic. When you hear the word exemplify, all right, and exemplify is spelled E-X-E-M-P-L-I-F-Y. What do you think of? Personally, I think of the word example. They sound very similar, don't they? So with exemplifying a lecture, the goal of the lecture is to clarify the topic by giving examples. It's just like it sounds. So if you are listening to a lecture about archaeology, let's say, and the lecturer is talking about estimating dates by reading tree rings, okay, he might then give examples about how the rings look under different conditions, all right? So he might say that reading the tree rings can be helpful to establish archaeological dates and give some time context. And then he might say that every year trees grow a new layer. They grow a new ring layer. And so this creates a series of concentric rings, right? And then the layers can vary with changes in the climate. So if there's drought, for example, the ring for that year isn't going to be very thick. It's going to be very thin, okay? And so what archaeologists will do is they will start from known climatic changes in the climate, and then count backwards from there to determine other information, right? So I told you what the topic was. It was the archaeological dating method known as tree ring dating, right? And then I exemplified it and I explained how it worked. So I said, if you have a thin ring, that means there was a drought that year. And then I explained the methodology. So cue phrases to indicate that the lecturer is exemplifying a topic include, for example, because you're giving examples. For instance, in this case, or to illustrate, a very common one I've used in lectures before is let's say, all right, and then you provide your example. Or it could be something as completely straightforward as a classic example is, you with me so far? All right. So there are words and phrases that emphasize the application of a concept. So you might say, in order to see this more clearly, and then you would give an example of a time that tree ring dating was used to establish a timeline of different climactic events, okay? You could say, let's look at how this applies in the real world and then exemplify the topic that you're talking about, all right? And of course, we're never getting away from the rhetorical questions. So you could always have a rhetorical question like, how does this show up in the real world? And then they would give you a scenario they would exemplify. Or, where can we find this? Where can we see this in real life? Okay. So we've talked about exemplifying a topic. Now let's talk about describing a process or sequence of events. So sometimes a lecturer's goal is to demonstrate how something happens or how something happened, all right, by organizing the information. I don't know why this is organizing the information according to a process or a series of events. And this is very common in history lectures, right? So let's say that you are talking about the history of chocolate, all right? Like the food, chocolate. So as the events are explained to you, you might start taking dated timeline notes. And you might say, okay, well, we're describing a sequence of events. And the first event that I have noted here is in 1500 BC. So 1500 being 1500 BC. And it might talk about how the Olmec Indians grew cocoa beans as a crop, and then they used that in an unsweetened cocoa drink, right? So then you would just keep moving that sequence downwards. You would say in the 16th century, the Spanish added sugar to it and created the sweet cocoa drink, right? Okay. So cues to recognize a sequence of events. Obviously, you're going to have the numeric sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? English, Haley, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, anyway, you'll have the numeric indicators. They'll say first, second, third, in a similar fashion to how they would use those if you were listing subtopics. But of course, this is a sequence of events. You might say words like next, then, subsequently, which means following after, later, after that. You might say prior to, which means before. So you could say previously. You could give it a timestamp, and you could say by the end of this year, or it will take, I'm making up a number because I don't know, it will take 100,000 years for Chernobyl to be inhabitable again. I made that up, but you understand this is the language that we're looking at. You could give a timestamp and say, in 1965, blank. In 1965, blank happened. We went to the moon. America went to the moon in 1969. Cool. You could say, if you wanted to contrast between two different states, you could say, originally XYZ, but now XYZ. All right. So some phrases or sentences, rather, well, I suppose both. Some phrases or sentences that signal a sequence of events or steps in a process that are not time-centric can include things like, in order to arrive at this point, we had to. So let's say that you're discussing a chemical reaction, all right? Your chemistry professor is illustrating this for you at the front at his lab table. He's got his coat on, his goggles on, and he is working with the chemicals right in front of you. And he is getting ready to cut you loose to go to your lab science stations and to perform the experiment yourself. When I say cut you loose, that means let you go off and do something. And so he will describe the process to you as he is physically illustrating it. And he'll say, so this particular reaction starts out with X, and then we Y, okay? Let's say that whenever he begins his experiment, he already has a compound that is pre-made. Let's say he worked on this before class and he has a compound ready-made, and he says, you'll notice here that I already have my solution started. To arrive at this point, we had to, and so then he's describing the process of events that took place in the past for him to arrive at this point, which is where he will pick up with you in describing the process further. All right. So again, rhetorical questions include things like, where did this idea come from? Or how can we do this? We're doing a science experiment. How can we do this? And then he describes the process so you can go do it with your lab partners. Or how did this come about? Okay, so then he gives you historical dates. Right. Lastly for today, we're going to talk about classifying subtopics. So whenever a lecturer is classifying subtopics, Their goal is to make a topic more manageable by creating those classifications for organization. So if you have a very complicated topic, breaking it down into its components and classifying its different facets according to their subcategory can be very helpful. So if you are taking a geology class, a class where you're studying different rocks and gems, and you have to categorize different types of gems and stones based on their properties, okay, then you would be taking a large chunk of information and breaking it down into different subgroups, right? So that is, in essence, classification. It's not as complicated as it sounds, okay? So geology is a good example, but it's not exactly my field of study, so I can't give you too detailed of an example. But let's talk about mammals. Okay, so let's go into biology with it for a second. And let's talk about, if this is an example in your textbook, let's talk about mammals, which, as we know, are animals with body hair. They are warm-blooded, and they nourish their young with milk from the mother. So bears are mammals. Humans are mammals, right? But there are 3 types of mammals. There are marsupials, which are born very young, very prematurely. Most marsupials have pouches, so they carry their young around in the pouch until they're old enough to be more independent. So you're thinking of animals like kangaroos and possums, okay? And then there is, and I hope that I'm saying this correctly, monotremes. There are monotremes, and monotremes are considered to be more primitive, and they are the kind of odd mammal that does not give birth to live young. Monotremes lay eggs. So if you think about a platypus being that mammal that looks kind of like a beaver and kind of like a duck, and it lays eggs. And then, of course, you have placental mammals that are more advanced mammals, yeah. And so their unborn young, are nourished by or with a placenta. So, for example, humans. Humans are placental mammals. Elephants are placental mammals. And so we have successfully now taken a rather broad concept, mammals, and broken it down into 3 subtopics that we have then classified different mammals into. Make sense? All right. So, cue words and phrases we cannot forget. Okay, cue words and phrases. So, you could say X being your topic, can be broken down, can be classified, can be subdivided or divided into 3, 4, 5, however many groups, schools of thought, divisions, categories, classifications. Okay, so that was a lot of word salad, but let's use it when we're talking about mammals. So mammals can be broken down into 3 categories. Types of mammals can be broken down into 3 categories. All right, and then you would say marsupials, monotremes, and placental mammals. You could also say instead, there are 3 classifications of mammal. There are 3 classifications of mammal. There are 3, 4, 5, however many types of, schools of thought about, if you're talking about, say, something philosophical, divisions of, classifications of. And then, of course, you have your rhetorical questions like, what types of mammals are there? Well, let me tell you. There are 3 types of mammals, okay? How can mammals be classified or categorized? Well, they can be divided into 3 distinct groups. So you're hearing a lot of those keywords. You're hearing divided, you're hearing classification, you're hearing categorized, all right? So those are the types of phrases and keywords that you would listen for if you were, in fact, classifying subtopics.